To be honest, when I discovered that I was merely a villainous supporting character in a novel, and the male lead had just become my boyfriend the day before, I was a bit devastated. Even as I lay in bed for half an hour after waking up this morning, the tragic ending from my dream was still vivid in my mind. Cassie Walsh was the female lead, and Wilbur Howard was the male lead. Although Cassie's grades weren't great, she was innocent, kind, lovely, and lively. She had an excellent and aloof childhood friend, the academic genius Wilbur Howard. Not only that, but she also had a loyal knight, the transfer student and school bad boy who was the second male lead. This novel was about the story between Cassie and these two men. While she was still hesitating between the bad boy and the genius, upon learning that Wilbur Howard had gotten a girlfriend, she finally realized that she had always liked Wilbur Howard. Wilbur had only used this fake girlfriend to force Cassie to see her true feelings. So the male and female leads hit it off, and after overcoming obstacles, they finally got together. As for that fake girlfriend, Cecilia Payne, after this, she not only privately threatened the female lead but also hired some ruffians to teach a lesson to the female lead. Of course, Cassie, with her protagonist halo, was certainly rescued by the male lead in time. This villainous supporting character naturally didn't have a good ending. She was humiliated by the ruffians. Her ugly face was exposed, and when her family sent her abroad, the plane she was on was hijacked halfway, and she ended up as a victim of the terrorists. It's a very typical plot for a villainous supporting character. I don't know whether to believe what happened in the dream. But my name is indeed Cecilia Payne. My boyfriend is indeed called Wilbur Howard, and he does seem to have a childhood friend. So did he agree to be with me because of Cassie? What am I then? A touchstone? In fact, although in the dream the female lead and male lead had a connection first, the Cecilia Payne in the dream completely brought about her final fate because she went too far, although the punishment didn't fit the crime. I thought about it, and I actually don't like Wilbur Howard that much. It all started simply because I was attracted by his looks. Like the Wilbur Howard in the dream, the real Wilbur Howard is indeed a modest young man. Although he's aloof, he's humble and polite. The most attractive thing about him is the beauty mark between his brows, which truly makes him look like he stepped out of a painting. Besides this, Wilbur Howard has excellent grades and is known as the academic genius, so naturally, he's not short of admirers. Although I liked his face before, I've seen plenty of good-looking faces, and Wilbur Howard was just one of the best among them, so I didn't pay much attention to him. But who could have imagined that when I accidentally entered the wrong swimming class changing room, I would see a different side of Wilbur Howard. A tall figure, slender yet muscular, water droplets flowing from the young man's neck to his collarbone, like fresh dew trickling into a deep pool. And faced with that face that finally showed panic and turned crimson, I very ungracefully swallowed hard. Who doesn't like a handsome boy? So I justifiably transferred classes and openly became Wilbur Howard's desk mate. It's not a big deal, really. I just donated a few buildings to the school. Wilbur Howard clearly remembered the last time I accidentally entered the men's changing room. When he saw that I had become his desk mate, although he visibly restrained his emotions, he still hurriedly pulled me out of the classroom after the lesson. I remember him looking at me with a cold expression, his glasses still perched on his nose. Prim and proper, I exclaimed inwardly, then casually glanced at the messy fringe on the young man's forehead. The beauty mark wasn't visible. What a pity! Wilbur had good eyesight. His porcelain white cheeks immediately flushed red, and he tried to lower his voice as he questioned, "Miss Payne, what are you looking at?" I unhurriedly withdrew my gaze and gave him a slight smile. "Your fringe, Mr. Howard." Hearing my words, Wilbur glanced at me, clearly not believing it. He said coolly, "Miss Payne, I don't know why you transferred to this class, nor why you became my desk mate. But I hope these coincidences have nothing to do with that incident last time." I looked at him sincerely and interrupted, "They don't. I donated a few buildings to transfer here, and to become your desk mate too. How could you think these are coincidences? Surely you're not that slow? Aren't you top of the year? Besides, I want to pursue you, so I came," I said righteously, looking at Wilbur's handsome face. "But don't worry, I won't bother you." Wilbur glanced at me, clearly not believing it, but he didn't say much more, only dropping "I hope so" before turning and walking away. And indeed, I didn't do anything to bother him, apart from passing notes during class asking how to solve problems. So when Wilbur slowly pushed a piece of paper towards me on the desk after school yesterday, I held the paper with my finger, saying somewhat reluctantly, "I'm sorry, my study time is over for today." The boy with picturesque features beside me was silent for a moment, then slowly opened his lips. "Just open it and see." I sighed, picking up the paper. "Will you be my girlfriend?" I slowly opened and closed the paper, then opened it again, and just like that, Wilbur became my boyfriend. But I didn't expect that on the very night I became Wilbur's girlfriend, I would have such a dream. On the way to school, as Mr. Thompson was driving me, I was still thinking about the dream I had last night when I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure outside the window. I quickly called out, Mr. Thompson, please stop for a moment." "Cece, what's the matter?" Hearing my words, Mr. Thompson, with his excellent driving skills, immediately stepped on the brake. I grabbed my backpack, leaving a quick "Mr. Thompson, I'll walk from here," then hurriedly opened the door and got out of the car. That familiar figure was none other than my new boyfriend, Wilbur Howard. Standing next to him was a girl in school uniform with a ponytail. One glance was enough to tell she was the cute and innocent type. Her eyes seemed to sparkle as she looked at Wilbur Howard. Cassie Walsh. The name flashed through my mind quickly. I didn't know what they were chatting about, but this childhood sweetheart pair seemed to be in their own world. Cassie was smiling shyly, while Wilbur's usually cool expression had softened into a faint smile. It was a lovely scene. I cleared my throat and ran towards them, calling out sweetly, "Brother." The two people in front of me didn't stop. I laughed coldly in my heart and raised my voice, "Brother Wilbur." Cassie was the first to stop. She turned around, confused, looking for the source of the voice. Wilbur Howard also stopped beside her, turning his head slightly. When he saw me, he frowned. I ran to his side, very quickly stuffed my school bag into his right hand, and then very quickly linked my arm with his left. I looked up at him sweetly and called out again, "Brother, I'm calling you, why aren't you answering?" Wilbur held my school bag and looked down at me silently. Cassie immediately jumped in. She looked at Wilbur, then at me, and asked, "Wilbur, who is she?" "I didn't know you had a sister." Before Wilbur could speak, I was already linking arms with him and smiled sweetly at Cassie. "Hello, I'm his girlfriend, Cecilia Payne." She didn't react at first, instinctively looking at her childhood friend beside her, her voice trembling. "W. Wilbur, she?" Cassie looked at the school bag in Wilbur's hand, then at the girl linking arms with him, feeling anxious and flustered. She had known Wilbur for over 10 years and had never imagined anyone would link arms with him like this. Wilbur indeed wasn't used to someone linking arms with him. He tried to gently pull his arm away, but couldn't. So he frowned and said coolly, "Cecilia, let go first." Hearing this, not only did I not let go, but I smiled even more sweetly and added for Cassie's benefit, "Girlfriend means I'm Wilbur Howard's girlfriend, you know." Valuing one's life is one thing, angering the female lead is another. Being the vicious supporting character can be quite fun sometimes. My smile grew even sweeter. Wilbur looked down at his girlfriend who was smiling so hard her dimples showed, and his tightly furrowed brows unconsciously relaxed a little. He turned to look at Cassie, whose eyes were brimming with tears, and after a moment of silence, he said, "She is indeed my girlfriend." As soon as these words fell, visibly, the female lead's face turned deathly pale. Goodness, Wilbur was quite harsh in trying to provoke the female lead to confess her feelings. As expected of the male lead. But with such intense pressure, surely the female lead wouldn't confess so quickly? That wouldn't do. I hadn't even taken advantage of Wilbur yet. I quickly tugged on Wilbur's arm, tilted my head to look at the still stunned Cassie, and said with a sweet smile, "You must be brother's childhood friend, right?" "Cassie, isn't it?" Then I blinked and said, "But Cassie, aren't you dating Crispin Fairchild? I often see you two together." Hearing Crispin's name, Cassie finally reacted. She was about to answer that it wasn't true. But remembering what Wilbur had just said, she suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of grievance and unwillingness welling up inside her. She bit her lip, then looked up, forcing out a smile. "Yes, I am dating Crispin." "Do you know him?" As soon as Cassie finished speaking, I looked up to see Wilbur's brows had furrowed tightly at some point. Wilbur looked at Cassie, wanting to say something, but didn't. Under Cassie's aggrieved gaze, he turned his head slightly and said coolly, "Cassie, you're not suitable for dating right now." Hearing this, Cassie exploded like a lit firecracker, immediately retorting loudly, "Why? Is it only okay for you to date, Wilbur Howard?" After saying this, without waiting for Wilbur's response, she had already run off towards the school with her backpack. Wilbur had just begun to say, "You and Crispin both have such poor grades." He watched Cassie's retreating figure and closed his mouth again, while I almost burst out laughing. I arrived at the classroom and looked at Wilbur Howard, who was preparing for the morning reading. Noticing the subtle glances from around the room, I pondered for a moment before speaking with a profound tone. "Brother Wilbur, I've decided to do something that will shake the heavens and move the earth." Hearing this, Wilbur turned his head towards me, his red lips parting slightly as he asked, "What?" I stood up, then leaned forward slightly. Amidst some terrified glances, I moved close to Wilbur's ear. Wilbur instinctively tried to lean back. But I had already grabbed his collar. As Wilbur watched the girl with dimples getting closer and closer, he felt a tickle near his ear. "Don't be nervous, brother." I straightened up and walked towards the teacher's desk. As I climbed up, I glanced at my watch. There were 10 minutes left before class started. Verity Lansing, Wilbur's #1 fangirl in the class, stood up and shouted at me angrily, "Cecilia Payne, what are you trying to do?" Other classmates began to whisper amongst themselves. I ignored her, bent down to find a piece of chalk on the teacher's desk, then walked straight to the blackboard and wrote a line. "Wilbur Howard, my boyfriend." After writing these 4 words, the class erupted in a chorus of gasps. I turned around with a smile and tapped the blackboard, addressing the class. "Hello everyone, as of yesterday, Wilbur Howard is my boyfriend. Please take note, fellow classmates." The class buzzed like a disturbed beehive, filled with noisy chatter. The #1 fangirl's eyes reddened with anger. She looked at Wilbur, who hadn't denied anything, then turned to me, "Cecilia Payne, what on earth are you doing?" I waved my hand dismissively, "Just informing you all of this news." I glanced at my watch again. There were 5 minutes left before class. So, I picked up the eraser and started cleaning the blackboard. Just as I was almost finished, our form tutor walked in. He was a young science teacher who was already starting to go bald. Seeing me erasing the blackboard, he nodded approvingly and turned to address the noisy class. "Look at Cecilia Payne, everyone. Not only is she 3rd in the year, with excellent grades, but she also likes to help out, coming early to clean the blackboard. And here you all are, making such a racket." The standing fangirl pointed at me, her words tumbling out in her anger. "Sir, you don't know, Cecilia Payne, she actually. Just now, she." Our form tutor frowned and looked at her earnestly, saying, "Miss Lansing, do you want to discuss something with Cecilia?" "That's certainly fine, right, Cecilia?" I put away the eraser and nodded along with the teacher, flashing my dimples, "Of course, Verity. If there's anything you don't understand, feel free to ask me." I paused, then winked, "If there's something I don't know, no worries, I'll ask Wilbur and then let you know." I could sense that Verity seemed to be internally bleeding. She stomped her foot, unable to say anything, and had to sit down. I returned to my seat, feeling quite satisfied. Suddenly, a thought struck me and my eyes lit up. I lowered my voice and asked, "By the way, Wilbur, don't we have swimming class today?" Hearing this, Wilbur Howard put down his book and turned his head slightly. "Yes, we do." I rested my chin on my hand, averting my gaze from Wilbur, feeling a tinge of disappointment for 3 reasons. One part of me was disappointed that Wilbur wouldn't be wearing his glasses in the pool. Another part regretted not being able to accidentally walk into the wrong changing room again, and the last part was, the school swimsuits were all the same. Thinking about the dull black color of the uniform swimsuits, I let out a deep sigh. Hearing my sigh, Wilbur seemed to understand what his girlfriend was lamenting. He adjusted his glasses and lowered his head slightly, revealing his reddening ears beneath his soft black hair. During lunch break, I was about to ask Wilbur to join me for lunch when I noticed he had already taken out a paper bag. He opened it carefully, revealing a white lunchbox inside. But that wasn't the main point. The most striking thing was that this white lunchbox was covered with numerous cartoon stickers, which seemed completely at odds with Wilbur's usual demeanor. I had seen Wilbur bring lunchboxes to school before, but this extravagant one was a first. And then it hit me, could this lunchbox be Cassie's? Just as Wilbur was about to open the lunchbox, I quickly slapped the back of his hand with a smack. Visibly, those long, ivory-like fingers instantly reddened from my slap. Wilbur followed the movement and looked at me. Don't you know that boyfriends are supposed to eat with their girlfriends? I met Wilbur's gaze without blushing or flinching. Wilbur didn't take the bait and just looked at me calmly, saying, "What are you trying to say?" I couldn't hold back and asked directly, "Wilbur, is this lunchbox yours?" Hearing this, Wilbur removed the glasses he was wearing and said nonchalantly, "Yes, it is." I pointed at the Peppa Pig sticker, "And this thing is yours too?" "Cassie put those on." I knew it. I laughed coldly, "Wilbur, you're my boyfriend. How can you use stickers from another girl?" Wilbur looked at me, silent for a moment, and then spoke, including what's written on the blackboard, "You've said boyfriend 6 times today." Wait, what? Who would normally keep count of that? After saying this, Wilbur paused, glanced at the lunchbox covered in cartoon stickers, and said in a flat voice, "Cassie put these on a long time ago, before you were my girlfriend." You have a point. I'm not an unreasonable person, I nodded, somewhat satisfied with his explanation, and said magnanimously, "I'll peel them off later then." I looked at Wilbur, but he wasn't looking at me. His eyes, now more distant without his glasses, were focused intently on the white lunchbox on the table. Wilbur's expression was impassive, I couldn't tell what he was thinking. But I didn't care much about that. He finally turned to me and responded with a sound. Quite cold. I smiled sweetly, resting my chin on my hand as I looked at him. "Wilbur, darling, shall we go to the cafeteria together?" Wilbur said, "The lunchbox has food made by Cassie's mom. We shouldn't waste it." Hearing this, I blinked and flashed him a considerate smile. "No worries, I'll help you eat it." While Wilbur Howard went to buy lunch, I sat down with his lunchbox covered in pink Peppa Pig stickers, finding a random spot to rest. Just then, a familiar voice sounded behind me, "Cecilia? What are you?" I turned around to see Cassie standing there, her brows furrowed tightly. She glanced at me, then at the white lunchbox, her expression clearly displeased. "Isn't that Wilbur's lunchbox?" Noticing Cassie's incredulous look, I replied very considerately, "Yes, indeed it is Wilbur's lunchbox." Cassie just stood there behind me, speechless. Then another voice chimed in, "Cass, why are you standing there in a daze?" I turned my head to see the newcomer wearing what looked like an expensive polo shirt. His handsome features and somewhat arrogant demeanor made it clear to me who he was at first glance. Crispin Fairchild. The rich and handsome bad boy in the novel. Wealthy and good-looking, seemingly rough but surprisingly considerate towards the female lead. Though his grades weren't great, he excelled at sports, capable of dazzling both boys and girls on the basketball court. What a backup option he was. Perhaps my gaze was too intense, as Crispin also frowned. "Who are you? What are you looking at?" I politely answered him, "Hello, I'm Cecilia Payne." "Hello, Mr. Backup. We're both backups in this story, why bother with formalities?" I looked at Crispin sympathetically, though I was still different from him. At least I could openly flirt with the male lead. Meeting this Cecilia Payne's gaze, Crispin felt inexplicably annoyed. He felt there was something odd about the way this girl looked at him. He didn't respond to me, instead turning to ask the dazed Cassie softly, "Cass, what's wrong?" Hearing Crispin's voice, Cassie finally snapped out of it. She shifted her gaze from the white lunchbox, looking at Crispin in confusion and saying distractedly, "Crisp, I'm fine. You've been acting strange since you came to school today." Crispin looked worriedly at the pale-faced girl beside him, then glanced at me with furrowed brows. "Does it have something to do with her?" He held on to the unresponsive Cassie and coldly asked me, "You said your name was Cecilia something, right? What did you do to Cass?" Before I could answer, the classmates around us who had been chatting and eating suddenly started whispering among themselves. Sure enough, Wilbur Howard had returned with his lunch. He was carrying just a regular school lunch tray, yet he held it as if it were a glass of champagne at a cocktail party. Except, the food on the tray was piled up like several small mountains. Lunch, ladies, is this fair treatment? Seeing Wilbur Howard approaching, I avoided Crispin Fairchild's intense gaze and stood up with a smile, calling out, "Wilbur, come over here." Hearing my greeting, Wilbur glanced at me before his eyes darted to Cassie and Crispin beside me. As soon as he saw Wilbur, Crispin immediately challenged, "Howard, what brings you to the canteen today?" Cassie tugged at Crispin's sleeve nervously, whispering, "Chris." Every time Chris and Wilbur met, they always ended up bickering. Crispin looked down at Cassie's hand on his sleeve, his face flushing slightly. How thrilling! As an onlooker, I glanced from Crispin to Cassie, then sneaked a peek at the expressionless Wilbur approaching us. I let out a long, silent squeal inside. Wilbur set down his tray piled high with food on the table and coolly replied to Crispin, "None of your business." He glanced at Cecilia Payne, who had stood up, only to find her intently studying Crispin. Studying what? Wilbur looked at Crispin, his cold gaze finally settling on his vest, revealing well-defined muscles. Wilbur silently averted his gaze. Cassie, who had been staring at Wilbur since he arrived, looked around and softly said, "Let's sit down, everyone's watching." Wilbur said nothing, only glancing briefly at her hand still holding Crispin's, before taking a seat. Cassie hurriedly tugged at Crispin beside her, intending to sit on Wilbur's other side. But Crispin beat her to it. Cassie stomped her foot, "Chris." I sat down too, eager for drama, and casually asked, "Oh my, Crispin, I heard you and Cassie are together now, is that true?" These words were like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone except Wilbur immediately looked up. "Cecilia!" Cassie exclaimed hastily. She quickly glanced at the silent Wilbur, her cheeks instantly turning red. Crispin, already blushing furiously, stammered, "What are you talking about?" I drawled with a grin, "But this morning." Before I could finish, Wilbur, who had been silent until now, interrupted me, "Cecilia, eat your food." So eager to protect his little childhood friend. I pouted, picking up my fork to start eating. Seeing that I had stopped talking, Cassie let out a small sigh of relief. She looked at the familiar white lunchbox, hesitantly saying to Wilbur, "Wilbur, this lunchbox." Wilbur replied flatly, "Cassie, don't talk while eating." Hearing this, Cassie could only close her mouth, feeling frustrated. But Crispin wouldn't listen to Wilbur. He pointed at me and said to Wilbur, "Howard, what's your relationship with her?" "I don't think I've seen her before." Wilbur, who hadn't started eating yet, heard Crispin's question and looked up slightly, suddenly smiling. "Fairchild, are you always this nosy?" The usually polite Wilbur put down his fork and said coldly, "If you're so free, why don't you eat some more?" With that, he pushed the plate of food in front of him towards Crispin. Without waiting for Crispin to respond, Wilbur stood up and turned to leave. Could it be for Cassie's sake? Is this what they call a love triangle? When I returned to the classroom after finishing my lunch, I didn't see Wilbur Howard. Instead, Aubrey Fortescue, who sits in front of me, turned around mysteriously and called out, "Cecilia!" I glanced at him. "What is it?" "Spit it out." "Your boyfriend was just called out by a group of girls," Aubrey summarized briefly. Hearing this, my eyes lit up. How exciting. Aubrey looked at me with a complex expression. "Aren't you going to check?" They might be confessing to Wilbur. I rested my chin on my hand and smiled. Listen to yourself. Wilbur receives so many love letters every day, each one a confession. Am I supposed to track down every single one? I'd be exhausted. But this morning, you wrote on the blackboard. That's a separate matter. I patted his shoulder. You've never had a girlfriend, so don't overthink it. While Aubrey and I were chatting away, Wilbur returned with an expressionless face. He was holding a bottle of mineral water that looked refreshingly cold. I greeted him, "Will, you're back." Wilbur glanced at me, grunted in response, and sat down with his water bottle. I looked at the bottle and asked curiously, "Will, are you just having water for lunch?" Seeing him nod, I took out my lunchbox that I had washed after eating. To be honest, Will, Cassie's mom's cooking is really delicious. I sensed a deep look of exasperation in Wilbur's eyes as he gazed at me. He looked away and merely repeated my new nickname for him in a light tone, "Will?" I didn't notice anything odd about Wilbur's tone, while Aubrey in front had already turned away tactfully. As I carefully peeled the cartoon sticker off my lunchbox, I said, "Aubrey just told me that a lot of girls called you out." Wilbur didn't respond. I turned my head in confusion and called out, "Bro, why aren't you saying anything? Is the mineral water too cold and freezing your voice?" Hearing this, Wilbur didn't seem angry. Instead, his voice became even more relaxed. "No. Some girls did call me out earlier." "Such a heartbreaker," I muttered. Wilbur clearly heard me. He glanced at his girlfriend who was busy peeling stickers off her lunchbox, then slowly looked away, the corners of his mouth curving up slightly. So I heard Wilbur's nonchalant voice again. "I told them I have a girlfriend." At this, I looked up at him. "Her name is Cecilia Payne." Before I could react, Aubrey in front started coughing violently as if he had choked on water. For some reason, I felt a sudden pang in my heart. I patted Wilbur's shoulder encouragingly and said, "Well done, keep it up." As I said this, my hand was resting on Wilbur's shoulder, and I could feel his body temperature through his clothes. So I squeezed Wilbur's shoulder in surprise and said, "Mr. Howard, you're quite cool to the touch." Aubrey's coughing grew even louder. Just as Wilbur was about to brush off my hand that was squeezing his shoulder, I mused aloud, "But I don't think your muscles are as big as Crispin's that I saw today?" Aubrey's coughing stopped abruptly. Wilbur's hand also froze in midair. A moment later, he mercilessly swatted my hand away and didn't speak to me for the rest of the lunch break. It wasn't until the last swimming lesson of the afternoon that I eagerly went to my locker to get my clothes, only to realize I had forgotten my swimming cap. I stood silently in front of the locker for a moment. Swimming lessons were meant to be relaxing for students, but some rules were unavoidable. For instance, girls must wear swimming caps. After pondering for a while, a person flashed through my mind, Wilbur Howard. Since most boys had short hair, the swimming teacher wasn't strict about whether they wore caps or not. In our class, Wilbur Howard was the only boy who always wore a swimming cap to every lesson. So, I slowly curved my lips into a smile. When Wilbur Howard came out after changing, he almost bumped into someone outside. He slightly raised his head, about to apologize, when he saw the girl had already leaned in close, smiling sweetly and calling out "Brother Wilbur" in a sugary voice. The distance was very close. Cecilia Payne had already changed into her swimsuit, the school's standard black one, which made her skin look even more like white jade. Wilbur Howard slowly averted his gaze, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly as he said slowly, "Cecilia Payne, what are you doing at the boys' changing room?" I said sweetly, "Brother, I forgot to bring my swimming cap." As I spoke, I glanced seemingly casually at the swimming cap on Wilbur Howard's head, frantically hinting. Hearing this, Wilbur Howard remained unmoved and just hummed in response. Seeing this, I could only take advantage of Wilbur Howard's unpreparedness and suddenly linked my arm with his. Before Wilbur Howard could react, his arm was already tightly pressed against the girl. "You want my swimming cap? Brother, why talk about wanting or not? I just thought, maybe I could borrow it?" I grinned, pulling on his arm. Wilbur Howard extended his free hand. I looked at his movement with great anticipation. Then he stretched out one finger, poked it against my forehead, and with a slight push, I had to take a few steps back, involuntarily letting go of his arm. "If you want to talk, just talk. Don't get so close." Wilbur Howard glanced at the hand that had been released, then calmly averted his gaze again. "If I give you my cap, what will I use?" Hearing this, I was prepared. I had been holding my hand in a fist, and now I extended it in front of Wilbur Howard. Wilbur Howard looked down at me. I opened my 5 fingers, revealing what was inside. Wilbur Howard looked at the pink hair tie and was about to walk past me without saying a word. "Don't go, Brother Wilbur." Seeing this, I quickly grabbed him and started promoting the pink hair tie. "It can tie up your hair. Although your hair will still get wet, but I can tie it up for you. How cute would that be?" Looking at Wilbur Howard's expressionless face, I took his silence as agreement. I stood on tiptoe and snatched the swimming cap off his head. I put his cap on my head, preparing to tie Wilbur Howard's hair first. "The hair doesn't need." Before Wilbur Howard could finish, I had already stood on tiptoe and grabbed his hair. I heard him sigh, and then Wilbur Howard's height suddenly decreased. "Oh no, It was Wilbur Howard who slightly bent down. I ran my fingers through my hair, momentarily at a loss for words. Wilbur's voice was muffled as he said, "Hurry up." Hearing him speak, I quickly used the pink hair tie to give him a small ponytail. I didn't dare laugh outright, but inside I was laughing so hard I thought I might hurt myself. The handsome boy straightened up with his little ponytail, his expression cold. "Are you done?" I gave him a thumbs up with a grin. "Looks great." "Wilbur." "Sorry, my skills are a bit rough. I'll definitely practice more and give you an even prettier one next time." He glanced at me, unmoved, and pushed away the thumb that was nearly touching his nose before walking off. As soon as he left, I finally burst out laughing. But then another thought occurred to me. Wilbur Howard and I are in the same class, while Cassie Walsh and Crispin Fairchild are in a different one. And today's swimming lesson has our two classes together. Just like the main characters they are, conveniently having swimming class together again this week. When the swimming instructor came to gather everyone, he led us through some warm-up exercises, checked that our swimwear was appropriate, and then let us do our own thing. Standing at the back, I glanced at Wilbur, feeling rather wistful. Just then he suddenly turned his head, as if sensing my gaze. I met his eyes and walked straight up to him. "Mr. Howard, why aren't you swimming?" I asked with a smile. Wilbur looked at me and said, "Aren't you going in?" I yawned lazily and said, "I only want to come to swimming class to watch you swim." "There's nothing fun about swimming myself." "You seem to be quite good at swimming," Wilbur said, already immune to my flowery words. "I'm all right," I said, glancing at the pool. Rather boastfully, I added, "This pool, anyone who can swim a bit could just hop across it." Hearing my words, Wilbur's lips curled slightly. His smile was faint even when he did smile. Just as he was about to say something, a familiar voice came over. "Wilbur." I turned my head and sure enough, saw Cassie Walsh walking over. Something seemed off. I raised an eyebrow, realizing Cassie wasn't wearing the school's uniform swimsuit, but rather a floral print swim dress. How is she allowed not to wear the uniform? I touched my smooth swim cap, feeling like a question mark could pop up above my head. Cassie walked over shyly. She looked at Wilbur and smiled. "Wilbur, why aren't you wearing a swim cap today?" Something flashed in Wilbur's eyes that I couldn't quite catch. Since Cassie had come over, he had turned to look at her. "Gave it to Cecilia," Wilbur said, his voice sounding flat and emotionless. The smile on Cassie's face faltered for a moment, then she turned slightly to look at me standing off to the side, clearly out of place. Curious, I spoke up. "Cassie, how come you're wearing your own swimsuit?" "Your teacher allows that." Cassie smiled and said, "The school-issued swimsuit was damaged, and I haven't bought a new one yet, so I wore my own today." Hearing this, I had a moment of realization. The school swimsuits may be ugly, but they're practically fireproof. "Cassie, you're amazing to have managed to damage one." Behind me, Cassie was saying to Wilbur, "Wilbur, what I said this morning about dating was just casual talk, don't take it seriously." Wilbur responded like a teacher, "You and Crispin aren't doing well in your studies. You should be focusing on your schoolwork right now." "I know." Cassie's voice became dejected upon hearing Wilbur say this. She seemed unhappy. "Then you and Cecilia." Wilbur didn't speak. He appeared to be thinking about something. After a moment, he slowly said, "Cassie, Cecilia is third in our year." I sat by the edge of the pool, my sharp ears catching Cassie and Cecilia. He uses such an affectionate nickname for Cassie, but my full name for me? "Wilbur, how can you judge people by their grades?" Cassie seemed a bit angry. She wanted to say something more, but held back. Then she stomped over to where I was sitting. I looked up as I heard her approach, seeing an angry-looking Cassie coming towards me. She looked down, meeting my gaze. Then suddenly her foot slipped, and she fell into the pool in front of her. Her falling would have been one thing, but as she fell, she grabbed me and pulled me in two. I was caught off guard by Cassie, with no time to react before I found myself plunging into the water. At the same time, I heard Cassie's heart-wrenching scream. As water splashed around me, I choked on a mouthful and struggled to wave my arms. Just then, I heard a splash. I opened my eyes, which had been closed, and through my blurry vision, I saw a circle of pink gradually moving away from me. Cassie's coughing was still in my ears, and the voices of the other students rose and fell around me. My body finally reacted, and I managed to grab the edge of the pool, finally propping myself up against the wall. Who did Wilbur save? I think it was someone from class 7. Cassie something. Didn't Wilbur save his girlfriend? The voices of the students around me were loud enough to make me dizzy. I shook my head as someone ran up to me, shouting, "Cecilia, are you all right?" He hurried over, crouched beside me, and looked around. No way. How did Wilbur end up saving another girl? Give me a hand, I said weakly, glaring at Aubrey as I clung to the edge. Aubrey quickly reached out to pull me up, still marveling at the situation. Ever heard of self-reliance? I said breathlessly. As I spoke, I turned my head slightly, and sure enough, I saw my boyfriend on the shore, his arms still around Cassie, who was clinging tightly to him. I let out a sigh, accepting the towel Aubrey handed me. In my peripheral vision, I saw Wilbur put Cassie down. A group of boys and girls immediately swarmed around them, the most anxious being Crispin, who had rushed over, looking as if Cassie might die the next second. "Cassie, are you all right, Cassie? You scared me to death." Crispin frantically shook Cassie, who lay in his arms, barely opening her eyes to look at Wilbur, who was now standing up. Wilbur's face remained impassive as he stood up. He took a towel someone handed him, politely saying thank you. He used the towel to dry his dripping hair, running his fingers through it as if searching for something, his eyes darkening slightly when he didn't find it. Hearing Crispin's voice, Wilbur looked down and said, "Don't shake her like that, she'll be fine." With that, he pushed through the crowd and walked towards me. I wrapped myself in the towel, looking at him expressionlessly. Wilbur glanced up at me. "Cecilia, are you all right?" Hearing this, I smiled. "Wilbur, where's the hair tie I gave you?" Wilbur was silent for a moment. Before he could answer, I wrapped myself in the towel and walked around him. As I started to leave, Wilbur instinctively grabbed my arm. I turned my head slightly, and he opened his mouth as if wanting to say something. Just then, Cassie's weak voice came from behind. "Wilbur? Thank you for saving me." "Cecilia, I'm sorry I pulled you in too." I looked tiredly at Wilbur's hand on my arm, then pulled away without a word and headed towards the showers. I cursed Wilbur Howard under my breath as I continued washing. Helping or not helping, it was all the same in the end. As it was still class time, hardly anyone came to wash up, and everything around was quiet. Suddenly, darkness fell, leaving only the sound of running water. A power cut? I turned off the shower and asked in the silence, "Is anyone there?" No one answered. What's wrong with this school? Having power cuts in this day and age. I sighed, fumbling for a towel to dry myself, then quickly found my clothes and put them on, ready to leave. Perhaps because it was too dark, some people rushing in couldn't see clearly and easily bumped into others. "I'm so sorry, so sorry." It sounded like a girl's voice. Fortunately, I was holding on to the wall, otherwise I would have been knocked over for sure. I rubbed my shoulder and replied, "It's all right." The girl apologized several more times before walking away. As I walked, the sound of water grew louder in my ears. It sounded like a shower. I sighed softly. No way, had I gone back to the shower room? But the walls here felt different. I groped for a while without finding any dividing door, and the shower sound was getting closer and closer. I had a bad feeling about this. I coughed lightly and called out, "Is anyone there?" Perhaps I accidentally didn't control my volume well, as I felt my words echoing far and wide in the space. The water sound stopped abruptly at that moment. I carefully took a few more steps towards it, when a confused voice rang out, "Cecilia Payne?" When I heard this voice, my whole body froze. Without a doubt, it was a male voice. Secondly, the voice sounded quite nice. But that wasn't important. What was important was that I felt the voice was somewhat familiar. I could feel my cheeks burning, and I stammered, "Huh? Who's Cecilia Payne? I don't know her." "I'm sorry, mate, I thought this was the ladies' shower room." "It's all because of the power cut, I'm sorry, I didn't see anything, haha." As I spoke, I quickly turned around, intending to leave. But the shower floor was too wet, and I was in a hurry, so my foot slipped, and the basket in my hand fell to the ground first. At the same time, a hand promptly grabbed my arm. Wet, and still warm. I didn't know if he had put on his shirt. I closed my eyes, resigned to my fate. "Thank you, unknown classmate," I said tearfully. The voice was silent for a moment, then laughed. "No way, Cecilia Payne, it's only been a year since we broke up? You can't even recognize my voice?" This voice sounded a bit annoying, but indeed very familiar. A face flashed through my mind, and then I slowly raised my head, facing the face in the darkness, and sluggishly uttered a familiar name, "Barnaby Lancaster?" As I spoke, that face slowly leaned in. This time, I clearly saw a pair of enchanting almond eyes, which winked at me. I looked at those eyes, remained silent for a moment, and then slowly said, "Barnaby Lancaster, are you dressed?" Before this person could answer me, the light suddenly came back on, nearly blinding me. As the darkness dispersed, not only did I see the young man with the almond eyes in front of me, but as I looked up slightly, I also saw Wilbur Howard with his deep-set eyes, not far behind him. There I was, a young and pretty girl, standing disheveled in a men's bathroom where I'd nearly fallen, wearing just a t-shirt. In front of me were my ex-boyfriend and my current boyfriend. My ex was eyeing me with interest, while my current boyfriend stood not far behind him, his face expressionless as he looked at me coldly. I slowly shifted my gaze, looking at my ex-boyfriend who was covered only by a towel around his waist. I calmly averted my eyes and said, "Sir, mind your manners." Barnaby Lancaster smiled mischievously. He always had this carefree attitude, but with his handsome features, he could never be truly annoying. His bright, alluring eyes were now fixed intently on me. "Cece, why won't you look at me?" he drawled, tilting his head. I calmly repeated, "Sir, mind your manners." Barnaby shrugged nonchalantly, "If I hadn't caught you, you would have fallen." "Is this how you treat your savior, not even sparing a glance?" "I'd rather have fallen," I muttered in response. Before Barnaby could say anything more, my current boyfriend, who had been ignored, slowly walked over. He was dressed now, but his hair was still wet, and water droplets clung to his neck. "Mr. Lancaster, you can let go of her hand now," Wilbur Howard said, his voice neutral and devoid of emotion, though his lips were pressed into a thin line. Barnaby turned his head at the sound, giving Wilbur a casual glance before asking me, "Cece, is this your new boyfriend?" I reluctantly nodded. Wilbur looked at me and repeated, "Mr. Lancaster, you can let go of her hand now." Hearing this, Barnaby grinned. He raised the arm he was holding onto me with, waving it in front of Wilbur like a child showing off a toy. "I won't let go." "What are you going to do about it?" Without a word, Wilbur politely walked over, politely swatted Barnaby's hand away, and even added a courteous "excuse me." Watching the force with which Wilbur removed Barnaby's hand, I inwardly winced for Barnaby. But why was he so anxious now? He hadn't seemed this concerned when I nearly fell into the water earlier. Barnaby withdrew his hand, inhaling sharply. "That hurt." "Cece, does your new boyfriend have violent tendencies?" As he rubbed his hand, he asked, "How did you know my surname was Lancaster?" Wilbur didn't look at him, keeping his eyes fixed on me. After a moment's thought, he replied coolly, "I'm not an idiot." He turned his gaze slightly. "And aren't you the one who's always second best?" Wilbur really knew how to hit where it hurt. Barnaby stopped rubbing his hand, his eyes cold as he smiled. "What's wrong with being second? At least I'm not like someone who left his girlfriend to drown while saving his childhood friend instead." I corrected him, not a stranger, his childhood friend. Wilbur Howard stood quietly beside me, his voice now somewhat low. "This has nothing to do with that. Cassie can't swim, but Cecilia can. There were other people who can swim by the pool. Why did you have to jump in to save her?" Barnaby Lancaster's mouth was relentless, like a machine gun. "Wait, you're from Class 2B, right? You don't have swimming lessons today, do you? What are you doing here?" I frowned as I thought of this and asked Barnaby. Hearing my question, Barnaby's face looked a bit strange. He tightened the towel around his hips and his voice was a bit unsteady. "I accidentally got a drink spilled all over me during break, so I got permission to come and shower." I just happened to see what was going on. Accidentally got a drink spilled all over him? How careless does one have to be for that to happen? I gave him a complex look, while Wilbur beside me had already spoken nonchalantly. It seems the flirtatious Mr. Lancaster is quite used to having drinks thrown at him. I suppose you're a regular at asking for permission to shower, aren't you? This was one of the rare times I'd heard Wilbur snipe at someone like this. I turned my head to see Wilbur with his brow slightly furrowed, coldly staring at Barnaby opposite him. Barnaby's face instantly darkened. Wilbur Howard, what do you mean by that? Barnaby said coldly, looking at Wilbur. Wilbur glanced indifferently at Barnaby, whose expression had soured, and just smiled, saying, Mr. Lancaster's girlfriends are all over the school, isn't that common knowledge? I rubbed my temples. Indeed, the day after I broke up with Barnaby, he already had a new girlfriend. But I took it quite well. Barnaby, while seeming flirtatious and fickle, was actually just a softy at heart, which caused him trouble. Sometimes he simply couldn't resist being soft-hearted towards girls who liked to act coy. This was also the reason why I broke up with him. I remember that when Barnaby and I were together, it was only for a few months. Since we weren't in the same class, we could only meet during breaks and after school. The rest of the time we were basically doing our own things. And when we were together, forget about holding hands, I don't know why, but he would recoil even if I just touched his clothes, as if I were some lecherous old pervert. Until one evening after study hall when I went to find him, I happened to see Barnaby tenderly caressing a girl's face in the corridor. That's right, the guy who wouldn't even touch my hand was gently stroking another girl's face in the corridor. So I brought up breaking up with him. Barnaby seemed to want to say something at the time, but didn't end up saying anything. The next day he was proudly showing off his new girlfriend to me. However, after that, Barnaby's relationships got shorter and more frequent. I picked up my basket, not wanting to waste any more words with these two, and quickly left this troublesome place. When Wilbur Howard returned, I happened to be packing my things. He was holding a bottle of water in his hand, which I glanced at without saying a word. Wilbur seemed not to have dried his hair, only roughly toweled it off, so it still looked damp. He walked to his seat, looked at me, and after a moment of silence, began, Cecilia, today. I interrupted him, I know what you want to say. But honestly, I'm not a child, I can understand some of your actions. However, Wilbur, as your girlfriend, I don't want to talk to you today. Please understand. I decided not to attend the evening study session today. Before I could leave the classroom, I saw a familiar figure waving at me. Cece. It was Barnaby Lancaster. I glanced around him, raised an eyebrow and walked over, saying, Barnaby, where's your girlfriend? We just broke up today, Barnaby sighed softly. Why are you using this to tease me too? He reached out to take my bag. Come on, I'll catch a ride home with you. Behind the window, Wilbur stood motionless, his hand gripping the water bottle tighter and tighter. Wilbur didn't return to Portslade Community Center with Cassie today, but went back to Beaufort Square alone. He rarely went back to Beaufort Square, and his father was seldom at home, with only a few hired security guards and housekeepers there. It wasn't until dinner time that Wilbur saw his father, whom he hadn't seen for half a year. Seeing his son, Mr. Howard was clearly taken aback. As he sat down, he asked, Why are you back at Beaufort Square today? Weren't you always staying at Portslade? After a moment of silence, Wilbur replied, I might be moving back here from now on. After dinner, he received a WhatsApp message from Cassie. Wilbur opened it and took a look. Cassie, Wilbur, didn't you come home today? He had already turned off the screen, but suddenly turned it on again and replied, I'll be staying at Beaufort Square from now on. We don't need to go to school together anymore. Please let your mom know she doesn't need to cook for me either. I'm very grateful for everything you've done for me all this time. After finishing my evening routine, I returned to my room to find my phone screen lit up on the bed. I glanced at it casually and noticed a dark WhatsApp profile picture requesting to add me as a friend. Upon opening it, I saw the friend request clearly stating, Cece, it's Wilbur Howard. Cece? Had Barnaby Lancaster possessed Wilbur Howard? I stared at this friend request in disbelief for quite some time. Although I was tempted to accept the request and ask Wilbur if he had been possessed by Barnaby, I restrained myself from this impulse. I genuinely didn't want to talk to Wilbur today. The next day, on my way to school, I spotted Cassie Walsh from the car window again. She seemed rather dejected, her head lowered, lost in thought. And Wilbur Howard wasn't by her side. It wasn't until I had finished organizing my books that Wilbur, who was never late, finally arrived. He looked as if he hadn't slept well, with faint dark circles under his eyes and a slightly pale complexion, though his expression remained as calm as ever. Unusually, there were beads of sweat on his forehead, as if he had rushed to school from somewhere. Upon seeing me, Wilbur seemed to be wrestling with something internally. He then turned his head slightly and called out softly, "Cece." I glanced at him and silently turned away. Wilbur tried again, tentatively, "Cece?" Resisting the urge to roll my eyes at Wilbur, I sat down and began reading my book. Seeing that I wasn't responding, Wilbur's expression became hesitant. He lowered his gaze and took out his own book, then seemed to pull out a piece of paper and began writing something. I didn't look at him again, immersing myself in my studies. The final exams were just a few days away, and I was determined to snatch the second place in the year from Barnaby Lancaster. During class, while I was focused on the blackboard, someone suddenly nudged my elbow gently. I turned my head towards the movement and saw a long, slender finger resting on the desk, beneath which lay a neatly folded note. I glanced at the person who had made this gesture. Wilbur Howard, expressionless beside me. I looked away, ignoring it. Then my arm was gently nudged again. I pulled my arm back slightly. This time, that finger simply moved the neatly folded paper directly in front of me. I reluctantly picked up the piece of paper and slowly unfolded it, only to discover that it wasn't just a small note, but rather a hidden treasure, almost like a short essay. Dear Cecilia CC, I tried to add you on WhatsApp last night, but you didn't accept. I wanted to tell you something there, but now I can only write it down here. I hope you'll read it. First, about the incident at the pool yesterday, I've thought about it carefully and I'm truly sorry. My initial intention in saving Cassie was simply because she couldn't swim, while you can. That's why I saved her. There was no other reason, I just felt that life was more important. This is my first relationship, and if there's anything I've done wrong, please point it out. I'll do my best to learn and improve. Secondly, I call you by your full name because I don't know what nickname would make you happy, so I've just been using your name. However, if you're not happy with that, I thought of a few options last night, as listed at the beginning of this note. If those still don't suit you, I've also found some terms of endearment online, like darling or love. Though they feel a bit strange to say. But if you like them, I'm willing to use them. Lastly, if there's anything else I've done wrong, please let me know, my girlfriend. I finished reading the essay-like content on the note, then placed my hand on Wilbur's leg. I could feel Wilbur's body tremble slightly, and then he deliberately turned his head away. Seeing his tightly pressed lips and quivering eyelashes, I smiled and then pinched his leg hard. Wilbur's expression changed almost instantly, and his hand instinctively reached down and grasped my hand that was on his leg. So I simply held his hand with one of mine, and then slowly wrote on his palm with my finger. I forgive you. After writing, I turned my face slightly to look at him and saw that his face was slightly flushed. He noticed my movement and looked at me too. My ears started to burn, and I quickly withdrew my hand, no longer looking at him, focusing intently on the lecture. Wilbur curled his fingers slightly and slowly lowered his gaze. During the break, the two of them fell silent for a moment. Suddenly, someone knocked on the nearby window. I stood up to look and saw Barnaby Lancaster. Why are you here again? I opened the window. Barnaby chuckled. What's wrong? Are you sick of me? He glanced at Wilbur Howard beside me and said slowly, I just came to see if you two had broken up yet. Well, thank you for your concern. I'm more curious about whether your next girlfriend will appear today or tomorrow. Hearing this, Barnaby was taken aback. A rare look of embarrassment flashed across his face before he coughed lightly and said, Why don't you break up with Wilbur today and be my girlfriend tomorrow? What are you thinking? You have more girlfriends than I have lipsticks. I'm not interested. Wilbur laughed softly beside me. I turned my head to look at him. Just as Barnaby outside the window was about to say something, Wilbur spoke calmly. "Barnaby, if you don't want me to smack your head like I did with your hand yesterday, you'd better pull your head back in." He slowly retracted his head that was poking through the window. I almost laughed out loud and said to the defeated Barnaby, "Class is about to start. You should go back." All right. Barnaby glared at me resentfully before turning and walking away. I turned to look at Wilbur, who was now looking at me, his gaze seemingly falling on my lips. His hesitant, calm voice slowly sounded, "What kind of lipstick do you like? Can I give you one as an apology?" I looked at Wilbur, his eyes clear and bright, his eyelashes glittering in the sunlight, now looking at me very seriously. "Sure, but one lipstick isn't enough for an apology. At least 99, I'd say." I rested my chin on my hand, tilted my head slightly, revealing 2 sweet dimples. Wilbur looked at me, unusually confused, and asked, "Why not 100? I opened my mouth to speak but ended up laughing first. "I was just joking." "You actually believed me." "I don't want any apology gift." Saying this, I handed him the lunchbox from yesterday that I hadn't returned yet. Wilbur took the lunchbox. The Peppa Pig sticker was gone, replaced by stickers of Sailor Moon plastered all over it. "Do you like it?" I leaned in to look at his slightly lowered face. He raised his eyes at that moment and smiled faintly at me. "It's lovely." Once again, I was struck in the heart by Wilbur's beauty. Although Cassie's mom's cooking is quite delicious, you can't eat it anymore. Suddenly remembering something, I pointed at the lunchbox and spoke somewhat unreasonably. Wilbur's gaze lingered on me, and he softly replied, "I understand." Then he continued, "I don't live as close to Cassie's family now, so we won't be walking to and from school together anymore." Saying this, he looked at me earnestly, as if waiting for some praise. I felt my cheeks getting warm. Under his gaze, I averted my eyes first, nodding and praising, "Not bad, not bad. You've even learned to infer now. Very good, very good." The next moment, a pair of hands gently touched my cheeks. I turned to look at him. His voice was soft, his eyes filled with mirth. "Girlfriend, you're blushing." I looked at Wilbur for a while without speaking, until confusion began to show on his face. Then I slowly said, "Don't tease me." Hearing this, Wilbur just smiled slightly and said, "I'll try my best not to." I glanced at him, remembering how he had arrived in a hurry this morning, and asked, "So where are you living now? Is it far from school?" "Now I'm in Beaufort Square," Wilbur said after a moment of thought. Today was an exception. I forgot that taxis aren't allowed in that area. Beaufort Square was a well-known luxury residential area. Most people living there had private cars and valued privacy, so taxis weren't allowed in that area. After having lunch with Wilbur Howard, we returned just in time for the afternoon break. Wilbur usually doesn't nap during breaks, but perhaps due to a poor night's sleep, he was resting with his head on the desk today. Unlike Wilbur, I usually take a nap during this time, but today I found myself unusually alert. I quietly observed Wilbur as he rested beside me. Just as I was about to move closer, I noticed that the person lying on the desk had opened his eyes and was looking at me. "What is it?" he asked softly. I shook my head. Wilbur slowly closed his eyes again. He must have been quite exhausted from the lack of rest last night and rushing to school this morning. At that moment, he suddenly caught a whiff of a sweet, familiar scent. Before Wilbur could open his eyes, a cool piece of candy gently touched his lips. Wilbur slowly opened his eyes, taking the candy into his mouth, and saw my fingers lingering near his lips. He reached out and gently grasped my hand before I could react. I glanced at my fingers, then at him, hesitantly asking, "What, do you want more?" Hearing my words, a hint of amusement appeared in his eyes, but he shook his head slightly and released my hand. "Is it good?" I leaned in and whispered, "I think these coconut sweets are delicious. I have a whole bag in my drawer." We were very close, and Wilbur suddenly leaned in as well, his eyes deep and intense. I was startled, but then I heard his measured voice. "I've seen them before. They're good. I really like them." Since it was Friday and the school hadn't scheduled any evening study sessions, I wanted to drag Wilbur to the bookshop. Why don't you just ask me if there's anything you don't understand? Wilbur asked while packing up his things. I shook my head. I'm not going to buy study materials. Of course, I'm going to buy some philosophical books. Wilbur glanced at me, clearly not believing a word. After entering the bookshop, Wilbur Howard didn't seem to have anything particular in mind to buy. I, on the other hand, completely forgot about my boyfriend and became engrossed in some philosophical books. The bookshop was crowded, and after I had picked out a few books, I turned around to find that Wilbur had disappeared from sight. I looked around but couldn't find him. Instead, I spotted two familiar faces, Cassie Walsh and Crispin Fairchild. Crispin was protectively guiding Cassie through the crowd. Cassie, who was already petite, looked even more like a fledgling bird in this environment. Despite the noisy atmosphere, I could clearly hear Cassie and Crispin's voices from the other side of the bookshelf. Cassie, it's so crowded here. Why did you want to come to this bookshop? Crispin asked. Cassie replied, I can find some workbooks here that I asked Wilbur about earlier. Crispin, why are you suddenly so keen on studying? Cassie's voice sounded a bit dejected. It's nothing. Wilbur is so brilliant, I want to catch up to him. Why is it always about Wilbur? Cassie, what's so great about him apart from being a bit better looking than me? Crispin sounded displeased. I was listening intently from behind the bookshelf, thinking to myself that Crispin had quite a talent for comedy. As they continued chattering, I glanced at the books above me and decided to reach for one to have a look. But as I stood on tiptoe, before my hand could touch the shelf, a pair of hands behind me reached the book faster. At the same time, a faint, spring-like scent gently enveloped me. Startled, I quickly turned around. Wilbur's calm voice sounded behind me, what? But before he could finish, perhaps due to the limited space between us, my turning motion seemed a bit exaggerated. As I spun around, Wilbur was lowering his head in confusion, and my lips inevitably grazed his throat. To make matters worse, it was right on his Adam's apple. My lips awkwardly paused on Wilbur's Adam's apple. I didn't move, and neither did he. Crispin, do you think Wilbur really likes Cecilia? They're together now, aren't they? It was Cassie's voice. Crispin hesitated before answering, well, he didn't save her when she fell into the swimming pool, but then again. Seemingly realizing he had said something that might harm his relationship with Cassie, Crispin quickly changed his tune, they are together now, aren't they? Cassie, Wilbur's just a player. Hearing this, I immediately turned my face away, while Wilbur slowly raised his head. His expression remained unchanged as he handed me the book from the shelf. Is this the one you wanted? I hadn't even turned to look at which book he had taken, so I hastily accepted it. To my surprise, the book was unexpectedly heavy, and I almost dropped it. Fortunately, Wilbur quickly extended his hand to support mine from beneath. Why is it so heavy? I finally turned my head to look down at the book. The 36 Strategies of Revenge by the Substitute Wife. The previously ambiguous atmosphere completely vanished. I slowly raised my head and questioned him, you think I'd want to read this? Perhaps you find it philosophical, he replied. I unceremoniously placed the book back in his hands and changed the subject. Did you hear the conversation just now? Wilbur nodded slightly. I did. Well then, Mr. Howard, what are your thoughts on that conversation? I'm not a player. Wilbur Howard quickened his pace to catch up with me. I turned my head, ready to continue arguing with him, but suddenly tripped over something. Wilbur, though quick, only managed to grab my arm. I twisted my ankle. I sat on the ground with a grim expression, one hand still held by Wilbur. Seeing my pained face, Wilbur put down the book in his other hand and bent down to ask me, does it hurt? I looked at him with teary eyes. Brother, the embarrassment has now overshadowed my pain. Wilbur couldn't help but poke my forehead with his finger. He let go of my hand and asked, do you still want this book? Yes, I said firmly. He then stood in front of me, squatted down with his back to me, and said calmly, can you get on? I painfully reached out and clung to Wilbur's neck. Wilbur put one hand around my waist, picked up the book from the ground with the other, and turned his head slightly, hold on tight. I know, I sighed, letting my head rest hopelessly on his neck. Wilbur's body, which was about to straighten up, stiffened slightly. Fortunately, the next 2 days were the weekend, otherwise I really wouldn't want to go anywhere with my twisted ankle. The weekend indeed passed quickly. When Monday morning came, I could barely get up. Just as I walked out the front door, I saw someone standing outside. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt, his figure slim, carrying a black bag that didn't look heavy. Seemingly hearing my footsteps, he turned his head slightly. I leaned against the door and let out a soft sigh. Wilbur looked at me with confusion. "How are you feeling?" I nodded approvingly. "Very good." Before Wilbur could speak, I smiled and clapped my hands. It's not bad to see such a beauty early in the morning, quite pleasing to the eye, a feast for the senses. Wilbur's gaze gradually moved from my ankle upwards, and then he slowly said, "I was asking about your ankle." He walked over slowly and took the bag from my hand, "But judging by your behavior, it seems to have healed quite well." "No, my ankle has started hurting again," I looked at him and said decisively. Hearing this, Wilbur bent down and gently touched my ankle with his finger. "Where does it hurt?" I also slowly bent down, smiling as I whispered in his ear, "I'm just kidding." He looked up, smiling helplessly. "But how did you get here today?" I asked, poking his face. Wilbur caught my hand to stop my finger from moving, while saying, "I walked. The security guard at the entrance saw me last time when I sent you back." "Let's go to school." Wilbur opened his palm, smiling slightly at me. "After you, Miss Payne." I noticed that Wilbur had started smiling more often, though still faintly, but it was indeed very attractive. This day actually passed uneventfully, if it weren't for Cassie Walsh coming after school. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Wilbur Howard from your class." Hearing this familiar voice, I looked up at Cassie standing by the classroom door. To my surprise, she was dressed very elaborately. From her slightly curled hair, her made-up face, to her eye-catching playful outfit, it was obvious that Cassie had some strong intention for tonight. Could it be? I glanced at Wilbur beside me. At the same time, Wilbur also looked over at me and asked in a low voice, "May I go?" "Go ahead." I wanted to see what Cassie was up to. After considering some things about that dream last time, most of my confusion had actually faded away. I believed I could distinguish between dreams and reality. But when these questions shifted to Wilbur, I couldn't help but pay attention again. I also didn't want to believe that Wilbur was only dating me to pressure Cassie. Looking at the two figures outside the window, I thought calmly, "Wilbur, I choose to believe you, to believe what I've seen and heard from you personally." The two standing outside the window didn't speak for a long time. Wilbur finally spoke. "Cassie, is there something?" His voice was calm, just like usual. Cassie Walsh bit her lip and looked up, enunciating each word carefully. "Wilbur, I like you." Most of their classmates had already left the room, and Wilbur Howard could see Cecilia Payne sitting by the nearest window, clearly trying to eavesdrop while pretending not to. He gazed at that figure, momentarily lost in thought. Beside him, Cassie observed Wilbur's distracted expression, confusion evident on her meticulously made-up face. She wanted to tug on Wilbur's sleeve but decided against it. "Wilbur," she mustered her courage and looked up, repeating, "I said I like you." Wilbur snapped back to reality, his gaze returning to Cassie with a hint of scrutiny and contemplation. After a moment, under Cassie's anxious gaze, Wilbur said softly, "Cassie, I have a girlfriend." But you don't like her," Cassie immediately retorted, as if afraid Wilbur would contradict her. She added with a pleading tone, "Right, Wilbur?" Wilbur shook his head. "No, that's not true. I do like her." Cassie clenched her fists, her usually cheerful face now filled with disbelief. "How can you possibly like Cecilia Payne? At the pool, you saved me first." Wilbur's expression remained neutral, as usual. "Cassie, do you know that's the one thing I regret most? Besides, I wouldn't save you because I like you, or not save you because I don't. You can't swim, but Cecilia can. Even if it were just for the kindness your parents have shown me these past years, I would still save you. However, if I had known Cecilia couldn't swim, between you and her, I would naturally have chosen her." Cassie bit her lip hard, trying to hold back the tears welling in her eyes. She stared intently at Wilbur. "Wilbur, does that mean you've never liked me before?" Hearing Cassie's question, Wilbur paused briefly, then said calmly, "Cassie, to be honest, even the day before I started dating Cecilia, I was pondering this question. Did I ever like you? I used to think that perhaps I did, a little. At this point, Cassie's eyes lit up again, but soon, Wilbur's voice continued. But after you and Cecilia fell into the water, I realized I probably never did like you. With you, I think it was more. Wilbur smiled slightly and continued, envy, perhaps? Maybe even jealousy at times? Your parents, your family, it seemed that by being near you, I could have those beautiful things that were so distant to me. I mistook this feeling for affection, but it wasn't. With Cecilia, it's different. When she's unhappy, I find myself wondering why, thinking about what I might have done wrong or what I could do better. It seemed to be the first time Wilbur had spoken at such length to Cassie. As he talked, his gaze involuntarily drifted back to the window. Cassie, I'm not a perfect person. I have many flaws. For instance, I've never wanted to be someone's backup option. He slowly looked back at Cassie, whose tears were now threatening to spill, his voice even. When my mother was still alive, I was the backup. When my father returned, I was still the backup. And with you, I was probably a backup too. Cassie immediately understood Wilbur's implication. She raised her eyes, her lips trembling, to look at the young man whose expression remained unchanged. He knew. He had always known that she had been hesitating between him and Crispin Fairchild. But, Wilbur, I like you. We've known each other for over 10 years. Don't you have any feelings for me at all? Cassie shook her head, as if trying to deny everything he had said. Wilbur Howard was silent for a moment before replying earnestly, Cassie, my feelings for you have never been romantic. Cassie kept shaking her head, her voice trembling, no, that's not true, it can't be. As she spoke, she reached out, trying to grasp Wilbur's hand. Just then, a loud noise came from the classroom behind them, followed by a girl's startled cry. Hearing this, Cassie hadn't yet processed what was happening, but she saw the young man's expression change abruptly as he turned and ran into the classroom. She watched his retreating figure, holding back tears as she slowly walked to the front of the classroom. She still couldn't believe it. She refused to believe that Wilbur didn't like her. He must be lying to her. He was angry that she had considered Crispin. It must be that. Cassie leaned against the classroom door and peered inside. I had been secretly watching Cassie and Wilbur having what seemed like a normal conversation, but who could have imagined that Cassie would start reaching out to touch Wilbur? How could I, Cecilia Payne, tolerate that? So I just pushed my chair a bit and let out a pretend startled cry. That's why Wilbur came running in. The classroom was already empty. He ran to my side and bent down, his voice tinged with worry. What's wrong? I pretended to be weak, slumping in my chair. My foot hurts. Where does it hurt? His voice was a bit low. Wilbur, everything hurts, I said, leaning slightly towards him. I never thought my voice could sound so gentle. Wilbur was clearly taken aback. A faint blush seemed to suddenly appear on his face, as fair as white jade. The usually calm young man suddenly lifted me by the waist when my palm touched his cheek. I instinctively wrapped my arms around his neck, the distance between us closing in an instant. He looked down at me for a long moment. My arms around his neck unconsciously tightened a bit. The young man gently set me on the windowsill, leaning in slightly. His voice was soft, like an alluring whisper, Cecilia. But in the next second, I slowly moved away from him, tilting my head in feigned distress. I wagged my finger and gave the now stiff-faced young man a sweet smile. We can't, Wilbur. There are people outside. Cecilia, you. The young man suddenly chuckled. He leaned in closer and said softly, Do you know how red your ears and face are right now? The young man lowered his head. Cherry blossoms fell together. After 10 o'clock in the evening, the lights on campus gradually dimmed. Wilbur Howard carried me on his back, walking slowly. From my vantage point, I could only see his jet black hair, which looked even softer under the dim yellow lights. I chattered away on his back. How could you kiss me secretly? I only kissed your finger, his voice was muffled. Was Cassie Walsh about to get handsy with you just now? I cleared my throat and interrogated. His fingers tightened slightly as he slowly said, she didn't have the chance to, and she wasn't going to use her feet either. I was stumped again. stammering, "That's just sophistry. Didn't you overhear everything anyway?" At this, Wilbur Howard couldn't help but laugh. His body shook a bit, seemingly trying to hold back his laughter, but failing. "You make it sound like I was eavesdropping." "I was listening fair and square." "It's not my fault you were standing so close to me," I retorted. "You're right," he conceded. I fell silent for a moment, then reached out to poke him again. "But Cassie did have a point. You've only known me for a few days, how can you like me already? So just because I've known Cassie for over a decade, I'm supposed to be head over heels for her?" Wilbur Howard asked softly, with a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'm asking you seriously. Cecilia Payne, I have 10 parts of my heart for you, 9 parts are selfish desire, 1 part is a wandering thought." Before I realized that thought, it was already love at first sight.